At nearly 1,600 miles in length, the Ganges River in India ritually cleanses millions of people annually. By bathing in this river, one's own sins and faults and impurities are washed away. This trait is also shared by the Yamuna River, one of the main tributaries of the Ganges. But this notion of a river possessing curative properties isn't unique to India. The Sun River in Nigeria is also said to possess healing and cleansing properties, as well as the Wanganui River in New Zealand and the Urubamba River in Peru, all of which are still believed today to be holy waterways. Of course, the Israelites have their own magical river, which is mentioned in the first verses of our earliest New Testament Gospel, when Jesus arrives on the scene and is purified by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, we completed our coverage of the first book of Kings and the story of Elijah the prophet, who was once a sun god, and whose story was filled with solar imagery and reminiscent to other sun god myths. His story concluded in the second chapter of the second book of Kings, where we pick up the story today. Elijah's pupil, Elisha, takes up Elijah's mantle, literally, and follows in his master's footsteps. And like his master, who was taken up in a fiery chariot, the prophet Elisha is also surrounded by celestial imagery. After Elijah's ascent into heaven in a whirlwind and a flaming chariot, indicating there were two different traditions concerning his ascent that were merged into one, Elisha receives a double portion of his master's spirit. This is a reference to the idea that the moon reflects light from the sun, a concept that some ancient Jews were familiar with, as we learned in episode 52. This is why Elijah's spirit could only shine on Elisha if Elisha were facing Elijah. It's a reference to the sunlight shining on the face of the moon. In chapter 2, verse 13, Elisha takes up his master's mantle, indicating that the authority which rested on Elijah now resides with his pupil. I would also like to point out that this might indicate the transition from the old solar calendar that the Israelites once used to the lunar calendar that they transitioned to following their time in captivity in Babylon. Another detail of note is that Elisha asked to receive a double portion of Elijah's spirit. In the stories, Elisha performs exactly twice as many miracles as his mentor, demonstrating his increased power and importance to the authors. Where Elijah performed 14 miracles, the number of days found in a 2-week period, his pupil performed 28 miracles, the number of days in a 4-week period. These numbers were not accidental nor arbitrary. In a lunar calendar, each month contained 4 weeks, or 28 days. Additional days would be added in order to balance out the time to prevent the lunar calendar from falling out of sync with a solar year. Another point to consider here is that these two figures likely had rival cults, so the editors linked the two with Elijah's blessing of Elisha in order to heal the rift. By connecting them in such a way, they can pretend that no such rivalry exists. However, we can clearly see that it was the followers of Elisha who made this addition, as they attribute twice as many miracles to their god than they do to the rival god. We'll see this again later when the popular cult of John the Baptist is co-opted in the beginning of Mark's Gospel, and that prophet claims to be inferior to the one he baptizes, and again with Peter and Paul. This was a common practice. After Elijah's transition into heaven, Elisha retraces his steps, and his first miracle is a repeat of Elijah's final work. He taps the Jordan River and splits the waters, allowing him and his followers to cross on dry land, just as we saw with Joshua at this exact location at the beginning of his story. And, like that story, this crossing is also accompanied by a blessing. Elisha, like his mentor, has many parallels with Moses and Joshua, and as soon as he crosses the Jordan River and nears the city of Jericho, we find another such parallel, and Elisha's second miracle. The people of the city tell Elisha that their water isn't good to drink, so he asks for a dish of salt to be brought, which he casts into the spring and commands Yahweh to heal it. This bit of magic heals the spring, providing a supply of fresh water to the city. This scene parallels Moses' purification of the bitter waters in Exodus 15. Another detail of note is the insertion of Yahweh into the text. They can't have Elisha working magic by himself, so the clumsy addition of Yahweh as the being responsible for the actual change is inserted into the text. We've seen exactly this in the story of Joshua stopping the sun. He commands Yahweh to halt its movement, and the deity obeys. This is another example of redactors attempting to cover up the polytheistic roots of these ancient stories. Elisha's third miracle brings chapter 2 to a close, and it's my favorite part of his entire story: the miracle of the she-bears. After leaving Jericho, Elisha was walking to Bethel, and a pack of children began insulting him for having a bald head. This occurs in 2 Kings 2:23-25. Elisha's response to the childish insults is befitting of a prophet of Yahweh. That is to say, his response is completely disproportionate and absurdly violent. Elisha decides to smite the children in typical Book of Kings fashion, which means loosing wild animals on them to tear them apart. In this case, a pair of she-bears explode onto the scene and destroy 42 of the boys, scattering their body parts across the road. And as a bald guy, I can sympathize with Elisha, but maybe he went a bit too far. This cautionary tale warns against mocking a prophet of Yahweh, similar to the warning Jesus gives in Mark 8:38. But there's more to this scene. The cautionary nature is how the story was repurposed. It isn't the origin. For that, we must turn back to Elisha's role as a moon god. Remember that physical descriptions of characters are rare in the Bible, and when they appear, we should take note. Just as excessive hair was a symbol of a sun god, as we've seen with Esau, Samson, and Elijah, a bald guy can denote a lunar deity. Remember that Jacob, Esau's rival, was called a smooth man in Genesis 27:11, as opposed to Esau being covered in hair. Ancient myths often involved stories which established a common practice, such as inventing a historical event in order to give an origin to a cultic ritual. We saw a perfect example of this in the book of Judges, chapter 11, with Jephthah's daughter. There, a pre-marriage ritual, which was common in the ancient world, is established by this character in a singular event, where she leaves the house with her friends to mourn her virginity. References to this practice were mentioned at the end of Judges. This story served as an ideological tale to explain why they maintained this practice. Here in 2 Kings 2:23, we find another such tale, this time explaining a popular Moonrise Chant used by a lunar cult. In the scene, the children are chanting, "Go up, bald head." Ancient people held rituals to help the sun and moon move across the sky. The dying and rising rituals of ancient kings were there to help the sun begin moving north and increase the length of the day after the winter solstice. This scene with the chanting children was an example of encouraging the rise of the full moon. And what about the she-bears? It's peculiar that the text specifies that they're she-bears and not just say that they were bears, as if the children couldn't possibly be mauled by any old bears. They had to be female bears. And that is because of what these bears represent. The constellation Ursa Major is the Great She-Bear, while Ursa Minor is the lesser she-bear. So this story was originally concerned with a moon god and 2 constellations, but was later historicized to offer an explanation for cultic practices involved with the rising of the moon, and even later used as a polemic against insulting Yahweh's prophets. Now, what about the number of the children? I'm not sure, but it's possible it's a reference to 42 specific stars that are in constellations which were also somehow involved in this story. Chapter 3 of 2 Kings begins by telling us that Joram became the new king of the northern kingdom of Israel and reigned for 12 years. This is the standard formula that is presented throughout the 2 books of Kings. A person ascends to the throne in either the kingdom of Israel or Judah and reigns a certain number of years. In the case of Israelite kings, we're told that they displeased Yahweh through idolatry, though the kings of Judah also share the same practices, but they're given a pass, showing that these stories come from editors in the southern kingdom. We're then treated to a brief tale of that king's reign before the events surrounding their death and a mention of their successor, along with the note that the rest of their biography can be found in the source material, such as a book entitled The Annals of the Kings of Israel. This means that these stories might have been meant as a supplement to the Chronicles of the Kings. These stories they add concerning the kings of Judah were meant to add to their greatness and holiness, while the stories that they added to the kings of Israel are meant to depict them all as heathens. In this case, King Joram of Israel removed the pillars of Baal, but was still found to be displeasing to Yahweh. This shows that the writers in Judah viewed the Israelite kings in a dim light, regardless of their actions, and also that the shift away from Baal worship was already in progress during this time period in the northern kingdom, around 850 BCE. You see, the authors of this text were arguing against the source material that tells of Joram's removal of these pillars, and by doing this, they're providing us with a reference to that shift in religious practice was already in progress and part of the written record that they're addressing. The shift away from ancient polytheism of their Canaanite origins toward the later Yahwistic monotheism was long and complex and took centuries. So Joram removed the pillars of Baal, but continued the sin of idolatry. If you recall in the last episode, you know that under the leadership of the Omrides, Israel conquered Moab. And here in chapter 3, verse 4, we learn that the Moabites were still paying tribute to the Israelites in the form of livestock. But eventually, they rebelled against Israel. So the king of Israel approached King Jehoshaphat of Judah and asked his assistance in making war on Moab. Jehoshaphat agreed, and they marched along with Edom towards Moab. When they were near the Dead Sea, they ran out of water and cried out that they were being delivered into the hands of the Moabites, which sounds to me like poor planning to march with no water in the middle of a desert. Jehoshaphat sent for the prophet Elisha because they feared Yahweh's wrath, so Elisha had a musician play while he summoned Yahweh. This concept of using music to summon Yahweh would later be removed from Jewish theology, but it can be seen elsewhere in the Bible, such as 1 Chronicles 16:4. Elisha's summoning spell worked, and we're told that Yahweh's hand entered the prophet and spoke through him, so the prophet was sort of like a sock puppet. Yahweh told him that the area would be full of pools of fresh water despite the lack of rain. This gives Elisha another water miracle after the parting of the Jordan. In the morning, the sunlight reflected off the water and made the valley appear red, convincing the Moabite army that the Israelites had killed each other in the night and the land was now covered in their blood. So they rushed into the camp to gather up the loot and were promptly ambushed and defeated. The Israelites pursued them, destroying towns along the way. The Moabite king, hiding in a city, slaughtered his eldest son and offered him as a burnt sacrifice, and the power of it was enough to turn away the Israelites. So we have a few things to unpack here. First, the miracle of producing water in the desert parallels that of Moses doing the exact same thing. And like the Moses story, the awkward inclusion of Yahweh's role in the story is likely there to downplay the role of Elisha as a miracle-working divine being. By inserting a few sentences, credit can be given to Yahweh for the actions of Elisha. The next point to examine is the idea that anyone, let alone an entire army, could ever mistake a sunrise over a pool of water for a scene of carnage. This detail, and the bumbling Moabites charging blindly into an enemy camp, is pure folklore. Such things just don't actually happen in reality. But this scene is often mentioned as a miracle, meaning that the blood-red water was some sort of illusion performed by the prophet Elisha. The final point to consider comes at the end of chapter 3, when the Moabites are surrounded. This passage has often been translated to mean that the Moabite king offered his son to a foreign god, like Molech, as he's the god typically depicted accepting burnt human sacrifices. But many scholars are no longer convinced Molech was a deity at all. Instead, they're now convinced Molech was a type of burnt offering, which could be made to any god, including Yahweh. So, we aren't sure which god the Moabite king offered his son to, but we can't rule out the possibility that the sacrifice was made to Yahweh himself. Now this may seem odd, as Yahweh is supposed to be on the side of the Israelites, but this detail could be included to explain why the Israelites lost this battle. You see, Yahweh turning against them has happened multiple times in these stories, so we shouldn't rule out the possibility here. So either Yahweh accepted the Moabite sacrifice and turned against Israel, or the Moabite god overpowered Yahweh and drove out his army. However the story is meant to be read, the sacrifice was accepted by an unnamed deity, and its powers caused the Israelites to flee. And if the authors believe that only one deity exists, then we'd have to conclude that Yahweh is easily bribed, and also accepts human sacrifices. But the answer may be found in France. The conflict between Israel and the Moabites, contained in 2 Kings chapter 3, is confirmed by the Mesha stele, which is currently housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Dating back to around 840 BCE, this black basalt tablet stands about 3 feet tall and resembles an old round-top gravestone. On it, we find an inscription concerning Mesha, the king of Moab, and the story of his struggle to throw off the yoke of the Israelite oppressors. According to them, they displeased their patron god Shamash, who turned his back on them and allowed the Omrides to conquer the nation. Finally, when they turned back to Shamash, they were able to send the Israelites away. This stele also mentions the punitive measures taken by the Israelites during this campaign, such as the destruction of cities mentioned in verses 24 and 25. So here at the end of chapter 3, it sounds like Yahweh ventured too far from his seat of power in Israel and was rebuffed by the Moabite god Shamash. Elisha's next miracle occurs in the beginning of chapter 4. Actually, chapter 4 is just a collection of miracle scenes for the prophet. Elisha meets a widow who's having trouble with her creditors, and her only possession is a single jar of oil. So the prophet offers to help. He instructs her to gather up empty jars from all of her friends and neighbors and pour the oil from her full jar into all the empty jars, and then sell the oil to pay the debts. She obeys him, and her jug of oil never runs empty. She finds and sells boatloads of oil and is able to pay off her husband's debts. This is another champion of the widow's stories we find in many ancient religious traditions. It also mirrors the multiplication of the flour and oil miracle performed by Elijah in 1 Kings 17:14. See the last episode for details on that one. We'll see Jesus perform a similar miracle in the Gospels with bread and fish. So if you have a little material and a prophet at hand, then you have everything you need. After this, Elisha travels to Shunem and is housed by a couple who set up a place in their house for the prophet to stay whenever he passes through. Elisha notices the woman had no children. Like Hannah, the mother of Samuel, or Sarah, the mother of Isaac, or the unnamed woman who was the mother of Samson, if a devout couple with no children come in contact with a prophet, you only have to give the man a single night in the house to help the woman conceive a son. It's a recurring theme in the Old Testament that we last discussed in the beginning of 1 Samuel. So, as you might have guessed, Elisha helps the couple to conceive and then runs off before the Shunammite woman's pregnancy is noticeable. Of course, all he did was work his holy magic, so this counts as another miracle. Many years later, when the child was grown, he suffered from severe headaches that eventually killed him. When the boy died, his mother ran off to find Elisha. Elisha and his servant Gehazi went to the woman's house, and Gehazi placed his staff on the boy's face in an effort to resurrect him, but nothing happened. So Elisha lay over the boy, matching up his own body with the deceased boy's body, and shared his body heat through their contact. This brought the kid back to life. This played out almost exactly as we saw in 1 Kings 17 with Elijah, complete with lying atop the boy and sharing heat to raise him from the dead. In fact, 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 4 are so similar that they're likely just two versions of the same story that have been applied to both prophets. Elements of this story will later be seen in the healing of Peter's mother-in-law in Mark chapter 1, Jairus' daughter and the hemorrhaging woman in Mark chapter 5, the Phoenician daughter in Mark chapter 7, and the raising of the widow in Luke 7. One detail of note is a curious passage that appears when the woman encounters Elisha. She falls at his feet and begs him to save her son. Elisha states that the detail of the boy's death was hidden from him by Yahweh. He should have somehow detected the trouble but for Yahweh's interference, or should have been informed by Yahweh but was not. Either way, the blame here for Elisha's ignorance for the boy's fate rests solely with the actions or inaction of Yahweh. I understand this to be similar to the scenes with Moses and the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh attempted to release the Israelites multiple times, but Yahweh prevented it so that he could work greater and greater miracles, and thus demonstrate his power. If Elisha were allowed to cure the boy, that would only show him to be a healer. But if Yahweh prevented Elisha from knowing of the problem until the child had died, then Elisha could resurrect him, magnifying the greatness of Yahweh in the eyes of his followers. And this Shunammite woman will be seen again in chapter 8, so don't forget about her. In verse 38, there's a community stew being cooked in Gilgal using sprouts and gourds that the locals had gathered. But plant identification wasn't their specialty, and so the stew became poisonous, and everyone who ate it became extremely ill. So Elisha sprinkled some flour into the pot and had them all eat more of the stew, which miraculously healed all of them. Finally, in the last few verses of chapter 4, we find another food miracle. A man from Baldilocks was bringing 20 loaves of bread and some grain as an offering, but since there was a famine in the land, Elisha told the man to give the food to a crowd of 100 men. He did so, feeding all of them with food to spare. Chapter 5 begins with a scene that illustrates that Yahweh wasn't just the God of Israel. Naaman, an Aramean commander, was a favorite of Yahweh and granted victory over his enemies by Yahweh himself. This happens at a time when Aram was in conflict with Israel and actually exerted control over it. In verse 2, we learn that Aram had defeated the Israelites and Naaman had captured a girl and made her a slave for his wife. So the Arameans enjoyed Yahweh's blessing even against the nation of Israel itself. But Naaman was a leper, though some versions just state that he had an unidentified illness. It kind of depends on which Bible you read. The slave girl from Israel told Naaman that he should visit the prophet in Samaria to be healed of his leprosy. So Naaman went there with a letter stating his intentions, along with a gift of gold and silver. But the king of Israel thought this was a pretext for further conflict. You see, if Naaman couldn't be healed, then the king of Aram could use this as an excuse for another war. But Elisha heard of this and instructed Naaman to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman became angry that Elisha hadn't summoned Yahweh to cure him, and cried out that he had magic rivers in his own land, like the Pharpar and Amana rivers, which were even holier than the Jordan. But his servants convinced him to listen to the prophet, and upon bathing in the Jordan, he became cured. After he was healed, Naaman shouts that there is clearly no God in all the world except for the God in Israel. This statement doesn't exactly make sense, as we're told earlier that Yahweh was not involved. So it seems we have another instance of a prophet's magical acts being co-opted by Yahweh. And this miracle scene follows a literary formula that appears throughout the Bible. First is the expectation of the miracle, Naaman journeying to Samaria to be healed. Then he expresses skepticism, his doubting that it will work, even though he traveled to another country for exactly this purpose. Then the miracle actually does work, his cleansing in the Jordan. He expresses astonishment, and finally we're told that it can only have come from Yahweh. Writing miracle scenes in this format is deliberate, and it's useful for apostles, as it preempts common arguments that they might encounter during their missionary work. After Naaman's bath in the Jordan, he returns to Elisha and proclaims his belief in Yahweh, which doesn't exactly make sense because he didn't convert to Yahwism. As we know from the opening verses of this story, he was already a worshiper of Yahweh and also had the God's favor. He then offers gifts to Elisha, but the prophet refuses, so Naaman then asks to take back 2 mule loads of earth from Israel, so that he can make offerings to Yahweh. Remember that a God's power is tied to the land. Just as Yahweh could be defeated by Shemash while in Moab, and the Israelites were unable to make offering to him while in the cities of Egypt, so too can Naaman not make offerings to Yahweh while in Moab. So he brings some of the earth from Yahweh's home into his own country so he can erect a shrine to the god. He also asks Elisha if he can be forgiven for the times when he has to help his master to bow low in the temple of Rimmon. So Elisha blesses him. Rimmon means thunderer and is a reference to a storm god, in this case Baal. After Naaman left, Elisha's servant Gehazi chased after the man and asked for the gifts that Naaman had offered to Elisha. Naaman handed over the gifts of gold and silver and fine clothing to Gehazi. When the servant returned to his master, he lied to Elisha concerning his whereabouts. But it was no use. Elisha had performed some sort of astral projection and sent his spirit out to follow Gehazi, and already knew where the man had gone and what he had done. To punish his greed, Elisha gave Gehazi the leprosy which had been taken from Naaman. In chapter 6, Elisha gets carried away with his miracle working and just flaunts his powers with the most petty miracle in the entire Bible. His disciples are building a new residence near the Jordan River, and one of the men dropped an axe head into the water. The man was distressed because the axe had been borrowed. So Elisha grabbed a piece of wood that was roughly the size of an axe handle and tossed it into the water, and his magic caused the axe head to float to the surface and join to the handle, allowing them to retrieve the tool. This style of miracle, Using magic to retrieve a lost item that's fallen into the water isn't new. We have a story from the pharaoh Senefru from 2600 BCE in which the Nile is folded over on itself in order to retrieve a piece of jewelry which had fallen overboard, so that the pharaoh could give it to a beautiful slave girl. Hop all the way back to episode 15 for more information on that scene. And this miracle makes Elisha a saint that poor people might pray to in order to locate a lost item, like Samuel does in 1 Samuel 9, or the purpose of St. Anthony for the Catholics. Elisha's next miracle occurs at verse 8 when Israel is at war with Aram. The Arameans made camp and then hid. Before the Israelites could rush into the camp and fall victim to the ambush, Elisha used his powers to discover the plot and warn them. This prompted the king of Aram to conclude that they had a traitor in their army. But his soldiers informed him that Elisha was actually responsible. How they knew this is never mentioned, nor are we treated to an explanation as to how the biblical authors knew about the conversation with the Aramean king. That's probably because these books are all written from a third-person omniscient perspective. The king of Aram planned to capture Elisha and surrounded the city where Elisha was living, but the prophet wasn't afraid. He responded to the surrounding army of chariots by summoning his own. Elisha called up the heavenly army, which descended in fiery chariots like those that collected Elijah, and their brilliance caused the Aramean army to go blind. This scene will be carried into Messianic Judaism, and the expectation of the armies of heaven appearing in the sky to defeat the enemies of God will later be expressed in Revelation 19:14. Elisha then feels bad for the thousands of people he just blinded and personally leads them all back to Aram, where the king wanted to execute the blind army. But Elisha wouldn't allow it, so he fed the chariot drivers, which cured their blindness, and after that, the Arameans stopped invading. Remember back in the book of Genesis when the ending of the flood story told us how the descendants of Noah spread out and formed all the nations and different languages? But then the very next sentence begins the Tower of Babel story, and it tells us that at that time, only one language was spoken. We have something similar here, and it likewise indicates that these are a collection of short stories that were never meant to be read as a continuous narrative. Right after we're told that the Arameans stop invading Israel, the very next sentence tells us that once again the Arameans attacked the city of Samaria and besieged it with their entire army. Food became scarce, and the people grew desperate. One day, while the king of Israel was walking through the city, he learned that a pair of women had made a deal to eat their children and share the meat with one another. On the first day, one of the women killed her child, and both of the women ate it. But on the second day, when the other woman was supposed to share her child, she hid the child instead of killing it. Upon hearing this, the king grew angry with Elisha and sent men to kill him. Why he blamed Elisha isn't specified, but it's possible this is actually part of the earlier story of the Aramean siege that the prophet had ended with the angel chariots. Remember that the purpose of that entire siege was to capture Elisha. Anyway, the soldiers marched to Elisha's house, but the prophet informed them that the horrors the people of Samaria suffered were not his fault, but the fault of Yahweh. So according to the end of 2 Kings 6, Yahweh is responsible for starving people becoming so desperate that they eat their own children. In chapter 7, Elisha tells the city that flour and barley will soon become available. But the king's aide replied by saying that even if Yahweh made windows in the sky, it wouldn't make a difference. This is a reference to the heavenly bread falling from the gates in the firmament, as it did for Moses and the Israelites in the desert. Elisha told the king's aide that the king's aide would see the grain with his own eyes, but he would not eat it. Meanwhile, outside the city, there were 4 lepers who were hanging around and waiting to die, whether by leprosy or famine. So they marched over to the Aramean camp, but they found it empty. And this is why I say that this is another version of the earlier story. The reason the camp was empty is because Yahweh had caused the Arameans to hear an army of chariots and flee in fear. So instead of seeing a phantom army, this version states that they heard one. Again, we're treated to another example of this third-person omniscient point of view, as the lepers know the thoughts of the Arameans who had fled before their arrival, stating that the vanquished army had not only heard a great chariot army, but had assumed that the Israelites had hired the Hittites to attack the camp. The lepers gathered up the gold and silver which had been left behind by the hasty Arameans and buried it before returning to the city to inform the residents. The Israelite cavalry was sent to follow the retreating army, while people looted the camp and collected the flour. How the Israelites still had living horses when food had become so scarce that they were eating their own children is never stated. The king put his aide in charge of the gate, but the man was trampled to death by the starving crowd as they rushed at the food, fulfilling the prophecy that he would see the grain with his own eyes, but wouldn't eat it. Remember that Shunammite woman from earlier whose son Elisha raised from the dead? She returns in chapter 8 when Elisha warns her of a 7-year famine that Yahweh will cause. This is a bit confusing, as we've already had repeated mentions of the famine already. But as I said before, these stories weren't meant to be read in this order. This is a short story collection, not a novel. Anyway, when she returns from the land of the Philistines after living there for 7 years, she found she was no longer in possession of her land. So she went to the king to complain. It just so happens that Gehazi, the servant of Elisha who had previously been cursed with leprosy, happened to be in the throne room telling the king about the Shunammite woman and her resurrected child, right as that same woman walked through the door. Quite the coincidence! The king was so impressed by the story that he instantly granted the woman ownership of her old farm and assigned a eunuch to help her to get it running again. He also gave her the equivalent of 7 years' revenue from her farm. After this, Elisha went to Damascus, where he received a message concerning King Ben-Hadad of Aram, who was very ill. The messenger, Hazael, was told by Elisha to tell the king that he would recover. This would comfort the king during his final moments, because he was about to die, and Hazael would become the new king. And Elisha then told Hazael that he would become the new king and would also commit great atrocities against the Israelites, and even rip open the bellies of pregnant women. When Hazael returned, he informed Ben-Hadad that he would indeed get well, and then the king died, and of course Hazael became the new king of the Arameans. The evil Hazael, being put in power to bring tragedy to Israel, is typical of Deuteronomic theology. Every defeat they suffered must have been a punishment brought upon them by Yahweh for some transgression. The authors are setting up for the total destruction of Israel by the Assyrians and the destruction of Judah by the Babylonians. This theology is meant to explain how the chosen people, as the Israelites had come to see themselves, could be so thoroughly defeated. The narrative then pulls away from Elisha to return to the point in chapter 3 where it informed us that Joram became the new king of Judah. So everything from then until now has been one giant insertion to wedge in the legends of Elisha into the history of Israel. We're also told that Yahweh wanted to destroy Judah but refrained because of his promise to David. Wait, what? The author is setting up for the impending destruction of Judah by Babylon. This gives the audience the impression that the destruction would have occurred earlier if it hadn't been for Yahweh's merciful pact with David. We get another indicator that this is written much later, when we're told that the Edomites rebelled and set up their own king. So Joram marched against the Edomites and scattered them, and, quote, "that is why they still haven't challenged Judah," unquote. In typical Book of Kings fashion, the rest of Joram's reign can be found in the source material called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. And he was buried in the city of David with his fathers. His son Ahaziah succeeded him as king at the age of 22 and reigned a single year. We're told that his mother was Athaliah, daughter of King Omri of Israel, and like many before him, Ahaziah did what was displeasing to Yahweh. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsofgenesis. And you can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsofgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsofgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsofgenesis podcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site at dragonsofgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.